Welcome to the haunting echoes of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a chapter of history etched in the sands of the Gold Coast. Today, we delve into the somber tales of the dungeons, the harrowing journey across the Middle Passage, and the eventual abolition of the abhorrent trade. History throughout the ages is filled with stories of wars, conquests, and the subjugation of local people. When exploring new destinations, it becomes paramount to immerse oneself in the rich tapestry of a region's culture, its diverse populace, and the entirety of its historical narrative, both the uplifting and the sobering aspect. By delving into these multifaceted layers, we foster empathy and gain deeper insights into the intricate complexities of our global community. Nestled on the picturesque coastline of Ghana lies numerous vibrant fishing villages. Gazing out across the tranquil harbor, one cannot help but be struck by the commanding presence of the stark, ivory-hued stronghold of the castles and forts used in the slave trade era. These historic edifices, once a bustling hub of activity, stood as a pivotal node in the intricate network of the Atlantic slave trade. These forts, once bastions of European colonial power, now stand as silent witnesses to one of humanity's darkest periods. Within these walls, countless souls were imprisoned, awaiting their fate. Men, women, and children torn from their homes, their identities stripped away, reduced to mere commodities. It all began with the allure of gold. It's astonishing to discover that two-thirds of the world's gold originated from West Africa. The Portuguese, led by Prince Henry the Navigator, were drawn to the tales of a land rich in gold and ivory beyond the vast Sahara Desert. Thus, in 1471, the first European explorers set foot on the shores of West Africa, specifically in the town of Elmina, located in what is now the Republic of Ghana. This region came to be known as the Gold Coast by the Europeans due to its abundant gold reserves, which were under the control of various African kingdoms, including the Ashanti. Seeking to bolster trade relations with the Africans, the King of Portugal commissioned the construction of a fortified trading post on the Gold Coast in 1481. The formidable fort at Elmina was swiftly erected by 1482. Word of Portugal's lucrative trade ventures spread rapidly, attracting other European traders who also established forts along the coastline. In exchange for gold and ivory, these traders offered a range of goods including firearms, gunpowder, metal tools, beads, mirrors, and alcohol. Elmina Castle, for instance, changed hands a few times. It was ruled by Portugal, 1482, 1637, Holland, 1637, 1872, Britain, and then Ghana when it finally gained its independence in 1957. The Europeans, driven by greed and power, plundered the African continent, capturing its people through deception, coercion, and violence. Originally, the castles and forts served as warehouses for storing precious commodities like gold and ivory. However, as the demand for enslaved Africans grew, they underwent expansion and tragic transformation. The once bustling warehouses were repurposed into dungeons to accommodate the human cargo destined for the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. For over 3 centuries, these fortified structures stood as grim symbols of human suffering, serving as primary hubs for the trade in enslaved individuals across the Atlantic. During the 17th and 18th centuries, various European powers, including England, Spain, France, and Holland, had established lucrative colonies in the Americas, focusing on cultivating crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. With profits hinging on slave labor, there arose an insatiable demand for African slaves. While exact numbers remain elusive, it's estimated that between the late 15th century and around 1870, when the slave trade was eventually abolished, as many as 20 million Africans were forcibly captured. Tragically, many perished, some while awaiting their fate in the slave forts, but predominantly due to the brutal conditions endured during the harrowing voyages across the Atlantic and the brutal exploitation on the plantations and mines of the New World. In bygone times, African tribal leaders engaged in warfare with neighboring tribes to expand their territories and acquire captives as spoils of war. As time progressed, some of these leaders grew wealthy by selling these captives to European traders. European traders actively encouraged tribal conflicts, incentivizing Africans to capture individuals from neighboring tribes. These captives were then transported to coastal slaving stations and traded for European commodities such as textiles and firearms. Additionally, Europeans themselves engaged in the capture of Africans alongside African slave raiders who would seize individuals and sell them to local merchants, who in turn would trade them to European buyers. Upon capture, individuals endured grueling journeys spanning hundreds of miles to reach the coast. Chained and often barefoot, they were forced to walk for months with little sustenance, arriving at the coast in a state of extreme weakness and sickness. When captive Africans arrived at the castles, they underwent scrutiny, subjected to examinations to assess their age and health. This assessment was crucial for slave traders, determining which individuals were deemed fit enough for the grueling voyage ahead. Subsequently, captives were herded into the dungeons, where they were mercilessly separated by gender, often resulting in the heartbreaking separation of family members who faced the grim reality of never seeing each other again. During the Portuguese era, the main courtyard served as the harrowing stage for auctions, where captives were treated as mere commodities to be bought and sold. In a cruel twist of fate, the once holy halls of the Portuguese Catholic Church were repurposed as auctioning halls during the Dutch occupation, showcasing the stark irony of religious institutions being complicit in such heinous acts. Many captives bore the cruel marks of branding inflicted upon them by their heartless slave merchants. As for the abhorrent conditions within the dungeons, prisoners endured unimaginable suffering. Despite sporadic provisions of food and water, often administered just enough to sustain life, they languished in perpetual darkness, deprived of sunlight and fresh air. Chained and shackled, they were denied the most basic human dignities, unable to move freely or even cleanse themselves, enduring a relentless cycle of despair and degradation. As the slave ships prepared for departure, the enslaved individuals descended a stone slide, leading them to the transit dungeon below. Here, men and women were reunited, some seeing each other for the first time since their arrival, offering a fleeting moment of solace amidst the anguish. Passing through the narrow entryway, they approached the final chamber, where the infamous door of no return stood ominously on the east side, its swinging iron gate serving as a grim reminder of their impending fate. One by one, the captives, still bound in chains, were ushered through the door, stepping out of the fort and onto the path that led them towards the waiting slave ships anchored just beyond the shoreline. With heavy hearts and resigned spirits, they embarked on the final leg of their journey, ferryway in small boats to a future fraught with uncertainty and suffering. And so, the enslaved Africans embarked on an excruciating voyage, lasting 2 to 4 months across the treacherous expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, bound for the Americas and the Caribbean, enduring unimaginable hardships and oppression throughout the journey. Those who survived would be condemned to a life of unyielding servitude, their fate and that of their descendants irrevocably altered by the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Packed like sardines in the belly of slave ships, Africans endured unspeakable suffering, disease, starvation, and the merciless brutality of their captors. The Middle Passage, a voyage of unimaginable horror, such as coastal slave forts across the Atlantic Ocean to destinations in the Caribbean, North and South America, lasting an average of 3 months, though sometimes as short as 6 weeks or as long as 4 months. This passage was marked by unimaginable brutality and inhumane conditions aboard the ships. Notorious for its overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, the Middle Passage saw shockingly high mortality rates among enslaved Africans. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of those bound for the Americas perished aboard these vessels. Packed tightly into tires below decks and often chained together, captives faced relentless dangers throughout the voyage. From the threat of epidemic diseases to attacks by pirates and the horrifying realities of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse inflicted by their captors, their plight was one of unending suffering and despair. Each clank of the chains, each stifled cry echoes through the annals of history, a haunting reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of profit. Yet, amidst the darkness, there emerged a glimmer of hope. The voices of abolitionists grew louder, rallying against the inhumanity of the slave trade. Finally, in 1807, the slave trade was abolished in the Gold Coast, marking the beginning of the end for this insidious chapter in human history. In the late 18th century, the legal transatlantic slave trade reached unprecedented heights. But by the mid-19th century, every European and American nation had officially abolished the trade. Denmark, Norway led the way in 1803, by becoming the first European nation to outlaw the African slave trade, followed by the United States in 1808, Portugal in 1815, Spain in 1817, and Brazil in 1825. Although the 1808 federal law in the United States halted the legal importation of new Africans, illegal slaving continued for the next half-century, with slavers covertly using vessels like whaling boats. Despite this, the institution of slavery persisted within the country until its formal abolition in 1865. In 1807, the British Parliament prohibited British ships from transporting slaves and banned British colonies from importing them. Furthermore, in 1834, Britain enacted the Slavery Abolition Act, which outlawed the ownership, purchase, and sale of humans as property across its vast colonial empire. As we stand on the shores of the Gold Coast, let us remember the resilience of those who suffered and honor their memory by ensuring that such atrocities never happen again. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for similar history lessons.